Resident Evil Village feels like the Resident Evil series is once again having an identity crisis. Does it want to be a horror game or does it want to be an action game? Where previous games in the series, this has been more of a meta discussion, game to game. Is Resident Evil getting more action focused or more horror focused? Resident Evil 8, however, seems to be having this inner struggle throughout the actual playtime of the experience. It's got horror controls shoehorned into what is clearly trying to be more of an action game. The game even goes full-blown action at times, and this inherently isn't a bad thing, but I'm going to try to make a case for why this identity crisis hurts the overall experience. And this questionable gameplay and scenarios is juxtaposed with what is probably one of the best looking games ever made. And holy hell, Dragon's Dogma 2 is going to look so awesome on this engine. And this game is clearly making callbacks to Resident Evil 4. So yes, of course, we're going to be covering the Resident Evil 4 remake on this channel. Be sure you're subscribed so you can check that out when it comes out. Like this video, and definitely check out the Resident Evil 4 VR video we have on this channel. And I'll always be active in the comments if you want to have a discussion. So let's dive into Resident Evil 8 and see just how scary Dami Mommy really is.
And await the light at the end. In life and in death, we give you glory, Mother Miranda.
So Resident Evil 8 largely borrows gameplay from Resident Evil 7. It's first-person shooting with puzzle solving. The problem is that Resident Evil 8 is a very different game from Resident Evil 7. RE8 leans much harder into action. A popular thing to do in horror games is to remove control from the player. Makes combat essentially a non-viable option, like in Outlast, or make movement clunky, like in the original Resident Evil games, the patented tank controls, so that it's much harder to line up these perfect shots. Or obfuscate knowledge from the player, either by removing the HUD, messing with the visuals, or making basic info harder to obtain. Resident Evil's gameplay leaned on all of these things. Resources were scarce, per survival horror. Movement was clunky, your aim sways, there's long recoil, and there's long reload times. And you're mostly fiddling in the dark, making you sensitive to the odd bump in the night. And this all really works in Resident Evil 7. The game is trying to be a horror game, so these inherent restrictions make even Shroud feel a little vulnerable.
Boom, headshot!
Resident Evil 8 adopts Resident Evil 7's gameplay, but it's not a horror game. At least it's not actively trying to scare you, like we previously discussed. So you're slapping horror gameplay and control onto a game that is kind of trying to be more like an FPS. Maybe not Call of Duty, but something more akin to Metroid Prime. Exploration, puzzle solving, shooting. And the shooting especially just feels really clunky here, with no scares to elevate the tension. Especially because the damn game hasn't learned from the series, and has once again tried to shoehorn in an action sequence in the end. We complain about it every time Resident Evil tries to do this, yet Capcom is still trying. It's like Capcom doesn't even know how to ratchet things up without ratcheting up the action. I mentioned the game is trying to be kind of like Metroid Prime with its exploration, combat, and puzzles. Yeah, this game has puzzles. So let's take a little sidestep. Outer Wilds is one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. Seriously, play this goddamn game. That game is entirely exploration and puzzle solving. The more you play, the more you understand the systems of the game, which allows you to manipulate the world and solve puzzles in some truly amazing ways. In Outer Wilds, exploration yields knowledge, which in turn yields solutions to puzzles to further drive your exploration. And it's all organic. The world behaves by a set of rules which are consistently applied throughout the game. Resident Evil 8 has the kind of puzzles where you need to find a set of keys, manipulate the keys to find the screwdriver hidden in the key ring, and use the screwdriver to unscrew a glass fucking cabinet that you could have just broken with your hands, or your knife, or your fucking arsenal of guns on you. There are archaic, cryptic, and ultimately feel like padding. Find the random MacGuffin to conquer this extremely obscure piece of the game. They are unrewarding and insultingly easy. You'll either complete them knowing the answer immediately while spending 10 minutes hunting down the stupid tool, all the while thinking of half a dozen other practical solutions the game won't let you employ, or the puzzle will be needlessly obtuse and you'll frustratingly resort to a guide, feeling agitated in the stupid answer. Either way, puzzles in the game leave you unfulfilled.
I don't know. Unfulfilled?
Unfilled?
Unfulfilled.
To the game's credit, there is a nice balance of variety in puzzles, combat, and exploration. In the village, there's a seemingly perfect balance between the three. Between plot areas, you can further explore the village for helpful items. While you explore, there's some light combat and basic puzzles. It's all there. For set-piece plot events, there's usually a major focus on one key aspect of gameplay. The doll section of the game is entirely puzzle solving, the vampires are largely exploration based, and the fish and Frankenstein are mostly combat focused. Basically, sometimes the game will dedicate several hours to one pillar of gameplay, but it never lasts for too long, and it pushes the concepts as far as they can go and then thrusts you back into the perfectly balanced hub world. Crafting ammo is poorly implemented in this game, and I would argue is largely bad in both action games and in survival horror. In survival horror, players shouldn't have a choice to craft ammo. You got 3 pistol shots and 1 shotgun shot. You got a knife, and there's 5 enemies. You gotta figure that out, bud. Allowing you to instead craft 10 pistol shots gives way too much agency to the player. In action games, pausing the game to craft ammo just breaks up the pace. If you could pause Doom Eternal and craft whatever ammo you want, that would kinda suck. So while it's still fairly unclear what Resident Evil 8 is trying to be, crafting ammo just doesn't seem to work for me unless it's trying to be Minecraft. So yes, the gameplay in Resident Evil 8 is balanced by the 3 pillars that it has, but unfortunately those 3 pillars are woefully underdeveloped. Combat forces first-person horror controls onto a largely action-focused game. Exploration is often limited to the village, with plot areas being largely linear, and puzzles are a throwback to 90s point-and-click frustration. So there are a ton of callbacks to Resident Evil 4 in this game, and it kind of feels like they were going for a spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4 at times. You start in the village, move to the castle, and finally crescendo into an industrial area. You can buy goods from the merchant, you can barricade houses from enemies, you can break boxes with your knife, you can manage your attaché case's inventory as a miniature puzzle, you ride in a boat and fight a big fish. The intro has a very similar 0 to 100 moment where you struggle to learn the controls while managing a large number of enemies in the village, and, well, the campiness.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Most of this stuff you can only do in this game or Resident Evil 4. These are very clearly callbacks. But here's the thing. Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest games ever made, and is one of the most influential games ever made. This thing has been ported to Timbuktu and back. I even had the damn thing on my iPhone 3GS. So naturally, this game is going to be compared to Resident Evil 4, and I don't think that was such a good idea for Capcom, because more often than not, Resident Evil 4 does a better job than Resident Evil 8 in my opinion. I had to do inventory management one time in Resident Evil 8, and I just had to drop one item. I love that they brought the mechanic back, but I literally never had to use it, and I carried as many guns as I wanted. I probably have played Resident Evil 4 a minimum of 5 times now on various difficulties, and I still need to manage my inventory semi-frequently. I found the merchant much less useful in Resident Evil 8. In Resident Evil 8, you find most of the guns in the village, and the endgame guns you can buy are extremely optional. Resident Evil 4, there are only a handful of guns you can find in the wild. Most of them you need to buy, and to the above point, you need to decide if they're worth the space in your attaché case. So, the merchant was basically a glorified upgrade menu for guns I found. There was no tension on what I needed and when I needed it, or if I needed to buy or sell things to make enough spare space to keep on going. I do think that the merchant being able to make meals with the different ingredients that you find in the game via hunting is pretty cool, and I do wish that it was expanded on or mattered more. And both these games are just campy as fuck.
You got a smoke?
Got gum.
Come on, talk to me. Damn it. I have to take this.
But if you think no-face Ethan Winters holds a candle to the ladies' man Leon S. Kennedy, then I don't know what to tell you.
You know you're kind of cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
May I remind you that you're still on duty. You pervert!
I get that Ethan is meant to be a step-in for the player, so he needs to be kind of generic. But to me, Leon was much more interesting to watch and engage with the cast. In general, while neither story is winning awards, I find Resident Evil 4's to be more compelling to follow. Resident Evil 8's story is mostly straightforward and gamified. Find the 4 magic MacGuffins and win. Resident Evil 4's plot ebbs and flows. Motives and objectives change. First, you need to find Ashley. Then you need to escape. But shit, now all of a sudden you have Las Plagas. So, well, now you gotta find a cure. And this is all while juggling the various side plots like Ada and Krasner. I guess Chris shows up a few times in Resident Evil 8, but Resident Evil 4 delivers a more thoughtful narrative, even if it is just absolute silly nonsense at the end. And I know I've already lambasted Resident Evil 8's gameplay quite a bit, and there's quite a bit more coming, but I do want to make one particular direct comparison to Resident Evil 4. When you start Resident Evil 4, even in 2005, it felt a little clunky, largely because, famously, you can't move while shooting. Early in the game, this effectively ratchets up tension as you line up your precious few shots before running away. Eventually, you pick up some more advanced mechanics, shooting weapons out of enemies' hands, shooting the legs to stall them, and eventually, you get good enough to stop running away and start running at the enemy for a counter-strike. And finally, you even learn how to line up some more complicated moves like the suplex for even more damage. And you can use all of these tools, high kicks for crowd control, suplex for massive damage to the enemy. And what's really neat about this is that the game shifts from horror into action. Your knowledge of the controls shifts from clunky to empowering. Resident Evil 8 has no such nuance in its gameplay. You are stuck with Resident Evil 7 controls in a game that goes from faux survival horror to straight up action game. There is a block mechanic, which you can then learn to get a shove with. But that I'm even not a huge fan of. It forces you to stay on the defensive, where Resident Evil 4 allows you to get creative and express yourself in the offensive. So if it isn't pretty obvious by now, I really think Resident Evil 8 should not have tried to compare itself to Resident Evil 4. It simply doesn't hold a candle to its predecessor. Were all these callbacks just to get people to buy the game? The cynic in me would say yes. Definitely part of the reason I personally decided to check it out. And unfortunately, I really think Resident Evil 4 is going to face similar issues, but for that, we're just going to have to wait and see. So I never do this, but I was actually too scared to finish Resident Evil 7. I tried it on PSVR, PC, PS5. I could never get past the Baker family inviting me over for dinner because I am just too damn scared. I can have the lights on, my girlfriend in the room, sound coming out of the TV instead of my headphones, and I just can't do it. Probably one of the 2 games in the last 5 years I've consistently tried to pick up and just had to put down and abandon. So I was gonna have this whole 2-part Spooktober review going in depth of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8. But 1, I clearly can't do Resident Evil 7, and 2, it turns out October is a pretty big month and I'm anticipating some big releases to review instead. So yeah, horror is clearly a tightrope to walk. If your game, book, or movie, whatever horror you're trying to do, is too scary, then you're actually risking losing a fraction of your audience. If things are too tame or not scary enough, then you risk your content being boring at best and mockery at worst. There is a razor-thin line where horror is just scary enough to be infectious and spread like wildfire. And, straight up, this game is just not scary, with, well, maybe one brief exception.
She's scary when she's angry.
You poured yourself a mega pint of red wine, correct?
A mega pint?
This game really isn't trying to be scary either, but the game clearly is trying to lean into the genre, just not be scary about it. For example, some movies the game calls out to. The black goat that you see in the village, that comes from The Witch, or the Vivitch, if that's how you like to roll. The doll boss is very analogous to Chucky. There's a well that reminds me to rub the lotion on my skin. And the Propeller Man is just, well, he's just straight up from Frankenstein's army. And in terms of games, I mean, an obvious comparison is the PT hallway from Hideo Kojima's PT and the giant baby monster, which is the one time the game is actually trying to be scary. There is 100% reverence towards the genre. The game just doesn't want to be off-puttingly scary. And that may seem like a good thing to appeal to more people, but I see it as diluting the genuine horror of Resident Evil 7. And speaking of weird, I struggle to understand what Resident Evil 8 is trying to be, survival horror or action. Because yes, it has a survival horror setting that isn't scary, and yes, it has survival horror mechanics, but laughably large inventories and ammo crafting make the theoretical idea of limited ammo moot, so it's kind of hard to praise the game from a survival horror aspect of things. But It's also clearly trying to be an action game. There's more shooting, a full-blown action sequence, and 2/4 of the sections that are plot-driven are actually just combat-centric. But as we discussed in the gameplay section, if we're going to judge this game as an action game, it sucks because it has clunky horror controls. So it's kind of jack of all trades and master of none, and it's actually quite hard to discern exactly what the game is trying to be. And the absolutely ridiculous story does not help. I know Resident Evil loves camp.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
And I understand the plot of Resident Evil 7 is also quite ridiculous, but this game really doesn't even try. Ethan isn't scared at all, which as a fill-in for the player, I would think you would want him to be at least a little scared, but this guy has just straight up balls of steel. I would totally give up on trying to save my daughter, and I think most others would, given that she's cut up into little pieces and put into a jar. And if you're fighting, I don't know what the fuck this thing is, then yeah, I'm out. Sorry, daughter, who's already cut up. I'm done. So why is this game pivoting to this awkward and lackluster, less scary setting and vibe? The cynic in me says money. Action-focused Resident Evil games historically sell the most. And believe it or not, until Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 6 was the best-selling Resident Evil game. And yes, Resident Evil 7 is currently performing very well. But remember, Capcom was initially very disappointed with Resident Evil 7's sales, and Resident Evil 8 is currently outpacing Resident Evil 7, and by quite a margin in year-over-year sales. I don't think it's a coincidence that they put a plot recap in the beginning of the game. I think Capcom saw that people were intimidated by the horror and skipped out, but jumped back in for this more approachable game. Of course, you could argue that the series usually pivots towards these more action-focused and less horror-focused games right after a scarier game gets critical acclaim to draw people in. Unfortunately, I think the series is caught in a loop. It's simply too big of a franchise for Capcom to make a true horror game. True horror, or at least something a bit more scary, or at least less action-focused, is usually what the critics and the fans alike clamor for. But lean too far into that horror survival over mindless shooting and you start to lose valuable sales. And sadly, I think Resident Evil 8 is simply beautiful, but all that graphical and artistic muscle is largely wasted on a horror setting that simply disappoints. It kind of just feels like an episode of Scooby-Doo. There's monsters, but they're not really meant to be intimidating. I think it kind of deflates the experience to go from a game that genuinely affected me, like Resident Evil 7, to characters that you can actually just straight up laugh at.
My daughter! My Ava!
Seems like a step in the wrong direction. The setting and characters are simply not used to their fullest potential. What's the point of having a stalking character when you can see her very clearly at all times? Much like the gameplay, these horror concepts are forced into a game that has little to no interest in scaring you. So Resident Evil 8 is a Frankenstein of sorts. It takes inspiration from classics like Resident Evil 4 before it, uses a new control scheme of Resident Evil 7, and it tries to mash everything together for a more appealing product than its predecessor to general audiences, and the results are somewhat lackluster. A game that clearly calls back to Resident Evil 4 but can't live up to its predecessor. Where Resident Evil 4's gameplay goes from feeling limiting at first to empowering, Resident Evil 8's starts as really clunky and stays as really clunky with few advanced mechanics to learn. Horror game controls are forced onto you for a game that simply isn't scary and doesn't appear to be trying to be. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this leaves you with a mediocre feeling first-person shooter, especially when the game refuses to learn the sins of its father and chooses to climax with an action sequence further pushing subpar FPS experiences. The puzzles bring me right back to the OG Resident Evil, and not in a good way. And while this game succeeds in setting, presentation, set pieces, and pacing, the thing you play video games for, that is actually playing the game, is often leaving me feeling wanting more. Resident Evil 8 isn't a bad game, but it feels like compromises were made for the sake of sales, and the end product makes it a middling Resident Evil experience at best.